For 25 years, my Uncle Ray was the family embarrassment. At least, that's what everyone said at Sunday dinners, usually after a few glasses of wine, when the truth came out sharp and mean. Still living off your dad's money, Aunt Helen would snicker. Some people never learn responsibility. Even my mother, who usually avoided gossip, would sigh and shake her head, muttering, "He's wasting his life, poor thing." I believed them. I grew up thinking Uncle Ray was a freeloader, a man in his 50s who lived alone in a small, cluttered house, never married, always smiling too easily, never working a steady job. I can still hear the way my cousins laughed when his name came up. Ray the Bum, they called him. But last winter, after my father passed away, everything changed. I was named executor of his estate, and in the weeks that followed, I started sorting through decades of papers, insurance forms, letters, even old photos from when he and Ray were young. And buried inside one of those dusty boxes, I found a faded note in my father's handwriting. Just 4 words. Ask Ray about the key. The words didn't make sense. What key? Why Ray? Curiosity turned into something heavier, a quiet pull I couldn't ignore. So one gray February morning, I drove out to Uncle Ray's place for the first time in years. His little house sat at the edge of town, its porch half swallowed by vines. When he opened the door, I was struck by how gentle his eyes still were. "I figured you'd come eventually," he said, as though he'd been expecting me. What happened next unfolded like something from a forgotten novel, a chain of discoveries that forced me to question everything I thought I knew about my family, about loyalty, and about what it truly means to give without expecting anything in return. I went there looking for a key, but what I found instead unlocked my father's greatest secret. Sometimes, the person everyone dismisses is the one holding the family's heart. The moment I stepped inside Uncle Ray's house, I realized how wrong the family had been about him. It wasn't filthy or chaotic like I'd imagined. It was lived in. There was warmth in the clutter, a teapot steaming gently on the stove, framed photos of my dad and him, both boys in denim overalls, fishing rods in hand. The place smelled faintly of cedar and something sweet, like old apples. "Your dad used to love that smell," Ray said, noticing my pause. Said it reminded him of the orchard behind our first house. He poured us tea in mismatched mugs, one chipped, one shaped like a penguin. I tried to remember the last time anyone in the family had visited him. I couldn't. He moved carefully, almost shyly, like a man used to being alone but not bitter about it. We sat at a small kitchen table covered with a faded checkered cloth. There, tucked near the window, I saw a drawer, its handle slightly loose, the wood worn smooth from years of use. Maybe it was coincidence. "Ask Ray about the key," my father's note had said. When I finally mentioned it, Ray froze, just for a heartbeat. But I saw something flicker behind his calm expression, something private, protective. He set his mug down slowly and gave a small, sad smile. "Your father said you'd come," he murmured. "He always thought you'd be the one to understand." Then he stood, went to that drawer, and pulled it open. Inside were folded letters bound by a thin blue ribbon, a tarnished pocket watch, and a small brass key. He placed the key on the table between us. "This," he said softly, "opens more than you think." I wanted to ask what he meant, but his eyes had already turned toward the window, as if watching ghosts only he could see. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, washing everything in that in-between color of truth and memory. That's when I knew. I hadn't come just to settle my father's estate. I had come to uncover a promise older than I was. Sometimes, family secrets hide not in shadows, but in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to ask. Ray pushed the key toward me, the metal catching the light like something alive. "Your father and I made a pact," he said. "A kind of test, though neither of us called it that back then." I felt my pulse quicken. My father, the man who built his success on logic and careful planning, had made a pact with the brother he barely mentioned? Ray must have seen the question in my eyes. He leaned back, the chair creaking softly. "It started the year your dad married your mother. He wanted to be sure he wouldn't turn into the kind of man our father was, hard, proud, all about appearances. So we made a deal. Every year, I'd hold on to something of his. Something small but real. If he ever forgot why he worked so hard, what family meant, I was supposed to give it back to him." I stared at the key. "And this?" He nodded. "This was the last thing he asked me to keep safe. He said one day someone else might need it more than he did." It sounded impossible, My father had been meticulous, private. He didn't do sentimental gestures. And yet here was this quiet man, living simply, holding the final piece of a secret agreement that had lasted decades. "What does it open?" I asked. Ray's smile returned, faint but kind. "You'll find out soon enough. But first, you need to prove you deserve to know." That last line hit like a challenge. He reached into the drawer again and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, aged, yellowing at the edges. My father's handwriting filled the page. "Follow these steps," it read. "And trust Ray." There were 4 instructions, written neatly in blue ink, each one stranger than the last. Ray looked at me with quiet expectation. "If you want the truth, you follow the rules exactly as written. No shortcuts." And just like that, I felt the ground shift beneath my ordinary grief. I wasn't just settling my father's affairs anymore. Some legacies don't come in money or property. They come as a question. Do you have the heart to understand? That night, I couldn't sleep. The paper with my father's instructions lay on the table beside me, and the brass key glinted faintly in the lamplight, as though it were breathing. I'd read the note a dozen times, but the words still made little sense. 1. Return what was borrowed. 2. Feed what was forgotten. 3. Listen where we never spoke. 4. Use the key only when the light is kind. I showed it to Ray the next morning, half expecting him to explain. But he just poured coffee and said, "Your father didn't write riddles to be clever. He wrote them to be felt." So I began. The first clue, return what was borrowed, led me to the mantel, where a faded photograph sat in a cracked frame. It was of my parents' wedding day. But tucked behind it, I found an old library card, signed in my father's handwriting. The book listed was The Giving Tree. I remembered him reading that to me as a child. I'd thought he returned it long ago. Ray drove me to the small-town library, the same one my father once visited. The librarian, now an elderly woman with silver hair, gasped when she saw the card. "Your father never forgot this," she said softly. "He told me it reminded him that love means giving until it hurts." The second clue, feed what was forgotten, took us to the overgrown community garden near the edge of town. There, a weathered bench bore my father's name, carved faintly into the wood. Beneath it, the earth was dry, forgotten. I planted a handful of seeds Ray had kept in a tin labeled, "For when it matters." By the third task, listen where we never spoke, I was trembling. Ray led me to an old shed behind his house. Inside, a dusty cassette player sat on a shelf. He pressed play. My father's voice filled the small room, steady, familiar, cracking near the end. "If you're hearing this, it means I trusted you. Not to take, but to understand." Silence followed, heavy and alive. The final clue, use the key only when the light is kind, still waited. And by then, I realized the puzzle wasn't about inheritance or secrets. It was about love passed quietly, like a torch. Some truths aren't spoken. They're lived, one small act of remembering at a time. That evening, just before sunset, Ray and I sat on his porch, the air glowing gold through the trees. The key was still in my pocket, warm against my palm. The light was soft, kind, as the note had said. I looked at Ray. "Is this the moment?" He nodded once. "If you feel ready." I followed him back inside. The house felt different now, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Ray led me to a small door at the end of the hallway, one I hadn't noticed before. Its frame was painted the same pale green as the walls, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Inside was a narrow room, barely large enough for a chair and a desk. On the desk sat a wooden box, and beside it, a stack of letters tied with the same blue ribbon I'd seen in the drawer. My father's handwriting covered each envelope. The top one had my name on it. I opened it carefully. "Son," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've chosen understanding over convenience." That's what I hoped for. He wrote about the years after his marriage, how success had come quickly, but with it, pride and distance. How he had drifted from the people who once grounded him. Ray reminded me what mattered, he confessed. When I started to forget, he made me give something back, to keep me human. Every year, it seemed, my father had sent Ray small tokens of humility. A returned book, a shared meal, a day spent helping strangers. Quiet rituals that kept him tethered to kindness. "If you ever feel lost," the letter continued, "go to Ray. He'll know how to remind you, too." I sank into the chair, tears blurring the ink. For the first time in months, my grief softened into something gentler, gratitude. My father hadn't just left behind a will. He'd left behind a way of living. Ray placed a hand on my shoulder. Now you know why I stayed here, he said. Someone had to keep the promise. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't wealth. It's the wisdom to stay humble when no one's watching. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter or the hidden life my father and Ray had quietly shared. It unsettled me how much I'd misjudged both of them. I'd spent years believing Ray was a burden while my father was the self-made success. But now, that story felt painfully incomplete. Still, the discovery raised a new question. Why had my father kept all this hidden from the rest of us? One morning, as fog settled over the yard, I confronted Ray. If this was all about remembering what matters, why didn't he tell us? Why keep it secret? Ray didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, watching a squirrel dart through the wet grass. Because, he said finally, your father knew that real generosity only lasts if it isn't seen. The moment you brag about kindness, it turns into pride. I wanted to accept that, but part of me still felt angry. Angry at my father for testing us, for making me piece together love through riddles. Angry at Ray for going along with it all. Later that afternoon, a black sedan pulled up in front of the house. My cousin Martin stepped out, slick suit, Bluetooth earpiece, the family's unofficial accountant. So this is where the hermit lives, he muttered, brushing past me. He'd come for the estate papers, but when he spotted the letters on the desk, his eyes narrowed. What's all this? I tried to block his view. Nothing that concerns you. But Martin wasn't easily deterred. He grabbed one of the envelopes and skimmed the first few lines before I could stop him. Well, there are deposits here. Regular ones. Ray's face went pale. Those weren't payments, he said quietly. They were gifts your uncle insisted I take. I never touched a cent. Martin smirked. That's not how it looks. I'll make sure the family knows where the money went. And just like that, everything my father had built, the trust, the lesson, the grace behind the secret, was at risk of being twisted into suspicion and shame. I looked at Ray, then at the key still hanging from my neck. I realized the true test wasn't over. Sometimes, when the truth is fragile, you have to fight to keep its meaning alive. That night, tension hung heavy in the small house. Martin's words echoed through every corner, poisonous and sharp. He'd stormed off, promising to set things right with the family, but I knew what he really meant. To expose Ray, to turn kindness into scandal. Ray sat silently at the kitchen table, staring at the teapot he hadn't touched. The same checkered cloth, the same worn drawer. It all looked the same, but something essential had shifted. I knew this would happen one day, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Your father worried about it too. That's why we kept it quiet. I paced the room, anger rising. He called you a leech, Ray? For years. All of them did. You let them. He looked up, eyes steady. Would you have believed me if I'd said otherwise? The question struck deep. I didn't answer. Because no, I wouldn't have. I'd been too proud, too certain of my own version of the truth. Ray opened the drawer one last time and pulled out a small, unmarked envelope. Inside was a simple receipt, yellowed with age. A single transaction, a large donation to the town's scholarship fund, made in my father's name, but paid from Ray's account. I used the money he sent, he said quietly. Not for me. For every kid who reminded me of him. Ambitious, scared, trying to do the right thing. My throat tightened. You, he nodded. Your father knew. Every year, he checked the list of recipients. It was our way of staying honest. The truth broke over me in waves. How completely we had misunderstood the man before me. While we mocked him, Ray had been living out my father's deepest promise. He hadn't been freeloading. He'd been serving. Then headlights flashed outside. Martin was back, and he wasn't alone. Aunt Helen stepped out of the car, her expression hard as stone. Ray, she said, stepping inside. We need to talk about these transfers. I stepped forward before Ray could answer. You don't, I said. You need to listen. This was it. The moment to defend the man my family had shamed for decades. Sometimes the real confrontation isn't with others. It's with your own heart, choosing which truth to stand for. Aunt Helen stood in the doorway, rain dripping from her umbrella, her eyes darting between me and Ray. Martin had that look he always wore when he thought he'd won. Chin high, voice clipped. He's been living off the family estate for years, he began. We have proof. Transfers, notes. Stop, I said. My voice came out calmer than I felt. You've got it backward. Uncle Ray wasn't taking. He was giving. They both stared at me like I'd lost my mind. So I handed Helen the receipt, the donation slip from Ray's drawer, and then the letter from my father's box. She hesitated, then began to read. Her expression softened line by line, her lips parting just slightly when she reached the part about the pact. Martin snatched the letter from her hand, scanning it quickly, his smugness faltering. This can't be real. It's real, I said. My father built his fortune with his mind, but he built his character with his brother. Every year, he sent Ray money to remind himself what that money was for. To be useful, not selfish. To help quietly. Ray spoke then, his voice unshaken. Your father wanted to protect you all from the trap he fell into. The belief that success means you owe no one. He learned humility here, in this little house, one act of giving at a time. Silence filled the room. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle. Aunt Helen lowered herself into a chair, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. All these years, she whispered. We thought. I know, Ray said gently. And it's all right. You believed what you were told. But truth has a way of waiting until someone's ready to see it. Martin looked away first. He folded the letter and set it down carefully, like it might break. So what now, he muttered. Ray smiled, faint and tired. Now you live it. Help someone who can't pay you back. That's the only repayment I've ever needed. When they left, the house felt lighter, as if a long shadow had finally lifted. I helped Ray wash the cups, the steady rhythm of running water filling the quiet. Before I left, he pressed the brass key into my hand. Your turn now, he said. Find your own lock, your own light. And I understood then. It was never about the key itself. It was about what it opened in me. Sometimes the richest legacy isn't left in wills or bank accounts, but in the courage to live with grace when no one applauds. A month later, I went back to my father's grave for the first time since the funeral. The leaves had started to turn, amber, gold, and deep rust, and the air carried that quiet chill that makes you reflective without warning. I brought with me the brass key, polished now, but still scratched from years of use. I set it gently at the base of the headstone. I understand now, I whispered. You weren't testing us to be cruel. You were teaching us how to keep our hearts open. The wind picked up just then, scattering a few leaves across the grass, and for a strange, fleeting moment, it felt like he was listening. Later that week, I drove back to Ray's place with an envelope of my own. Inside was a check, not from the estate, but from me. For the scholarship fund, I said. In both your names this time. Ray smiled, his eyes shining with that same calm kindness that used to make people mistake him for weak. He'd be proud, he said quietly. Not because of the money, because you saw it through. We sat on the porch after that, sipping tea as the sun dipped behind the trees. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was full of things understood but never spoken. In the months that followed, I found myself living differently. Slower, gentler. I started volunteering at the library where my father borrowed that children's book decades ago. Sometimes I'd see young families come in, busy, distracted, rushing,